Good morning, everyone. We're thrilled. We're thrilled with the wonderful response to Michael's very generous offer to speak to us this morning. And I did want to give him a proper introduction, though many of you already know him. Michael is a professor of Slavic languages and literature at U of M, and he has a particular research interest in Russian poetry. I don't know if he's going to recite any. And prose in the 20th century, as well as contemporary Russian culture. He actually was in Russia and Ukraine as recently as 2019, and today he's going to discuss the historical and cultural context which may help us have a better understanding of this terrible conflict that has engulfed Ukraine since February 24th. So thank you very much. We really appreciate your generosity, Michael. But I won't take your...
Thank you very much, Sarah. And thank you, everyone, for coming today. I must say, as everyone came up to me and said they were looking forward to my talk, they were excited, I felt a certain frisson of alarm. And I called to mind, I believe it is the French philosopher Montaigne, who wanted an appropriate inscription burnt into the beam above his desk. And first of all, he thought, je ne sais rien, I know nothing. But then he thought that was too affirmative. So in the end, he had que sais-je, what do I know, embossed on the beam above his head as he worked. So please try to imagine, and maybe I could have asked Jared to arrange this, that above my head are the words, what do I know? More to the point, in fact, what can I say after Bob's sermon, which I thought was so appropriate for today? And I also have to say I was terribly struck that the last line from St. Luke seemed especially appropriate in our gospel reading. And let me repeat the evangelist's words. As he came near and saw the city, he wept over it, saying, and this is the final verse of today's reading, if you, even you, had only recognized on this day the things that make for peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. So I'm afraid the words of the evangelist are much more appropriate than anything that I could say to you today. Let me also add that I'm not an historian, I'm not a political scientist, I'm a philologist, I write about culture and literature, so this is a very amateur exercise of my opinions. But here we go. I'm afraid there are some maps and there's some history for you all, but I hope it will help you to understand things, and I do hope my remote is going to work from here. I may have to move closer to, there we go. So let's begin with some simple geography. Where is Ukraine and how did it come to be? Well, I hope you all know, but I'll remind you anyway, that Ukraine is in Central Europe, bordering Russia, Belarus, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Moldova. It has a large shore on the Black Sea and also on the Sea of Azov. And this is how the country looks, or looked, perhaps we should say, in 2022. You can see that it's divided by one of Europe's major rivers, the River Dnieper. On the east side of the River Dnieper, the majority of the population is Russian-speaking, and on the west side, the majority is Ukrainian-speaking. These are the major centers of population. Here is the Crimean Peninsula, which was annexed by Russia in 2014, and here are the two so-called separatist units which Russia has supported and has now recognized as independent territories. This, perhaps, is a more appropriate map. This is from a couple of days ago. The UK military intelligence issues daily maps showing the nature of the conflict. And as you can see, southern and eastern Ukraine is largely occupied by Russia. These are contested areas, and these are also areas of bombardment and attack. Sadly, most of the country is under such incredible stress at the moment. So, where did all this come from? Well, sorry. The modern country of Ukraine is, as of course Putin has pointed out, first and foremost a creation of Soviet nationality policy. The Soviet Union was created with the idea that it would be a socialist country based on national units. Many of the administrative territories of the USSR were based on the majority ethnic population in those units. So modern USSR, the USSR of the post-war period, consisted at the top level of 15 republics, all of them named after what was the majority ethnic population of that area. Think of the slogan, the famous Stalinist slogan, national informed, socialist in content. So that's how Ukraine came into being, as a territory where the majority of the population was Ukrainian, although, of course, it was a very diverse, like most of these republics, a very diverse territory with, among many others, large numbers of Russians, Jews, and Hungarians, and a great many other nationalities on its territory. The Ukrainian Republic got bigger after the Second World War, when territories in the West that had previously, between the two wars, been part of Poland, became part of the Soviet Republic. And those territories, I'll talk about them later, had not only been part of 20th century Poland, they had also been part previously of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and before that of the Lithuanian and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealths. We'll see some maps there as well. In 1954, another addition came to the Republic of Ukraine. That was the Crimean Peninsula, which was moved from the Russian Republic to the Ukrainian Republic. The Crimean Peninsula is rather important here because it is where, in 988, the Grand Prince of Kiev, Prince Vladimir, accepted Eastern Christianity, Byzantine Christianity, for his people. It was essentially a political move in conflict and negotiation between the Rus people of the first East Slavic people and the Byzantines, but it led, of course, to the baptism of his people back in Kiev. So Crimea holds a particular place in the historic imagination of the East Slavs, although in fact Crimea was within the Ottoman Empire for many centuries before the Russian Empire took it in the late 18th century. When the Soviet Union broke up, as I'm sure you all know, we're all, dare I say, of a certain age, so we remember this very well, the Soviet Union disintegrated, actually relatively peacefully, into those 15 constituent Soviet republics, of which Ukraine was one. So it's as if the United States had disintegrated into 50 separate states. The highest administrative unit below the national unit became, in each case, an independent country. There's a long story to that, but let's just pass over that and take that as given. This is what the Ukrainian Republic of the Soviet Union looked like. Here is what the republic was in 1920. Subsequently, during and after the Second World War, it acquired more territories, mostly from Poland. And here we have what is mostly Ukrainian-speaking part of Ukraine. Here we have Crimea, which became part of the Ukrainian Republic in 1954. These are the lands that were occupied after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, then occupied, of course, by Germany, and then reclaimed by the Soviet Union. So that's what became independent Ukraine in 1991. So let's tell the story of two cities that are fundamental to our understanding of this territory. And forgive me if all this is too much like middle school history, but anyway, here we go. Oh, and by the way, something else I should say, I'm a Russianist. I don't speak Ukrainian, although I understand some. So most of the time, I will call towns by their Russian names. I do not mean to offend any of you Ukrainians. And of course, that's why I've put up the name of the city here in transliteration from the Russian and from the Ukrainian. So Kiev.
I have a question. I studied Russian. Doesn't Ukraine mean at the edge?
Yes, it does, and I'll mention that later. Maybe there are quite a few slides. Can we leave the questions till the end, if you don't mind? So Kiev. Kiev was probably quite a small settlement in the 6th century, as they now say, Christian era. I can never quite get my tongue around that. I'm afraid I still say AD, just as it says, by the way, on our Douglas Chapel. So I feel quite justified in maintaining that ancient way of talking of dates. But it doesn't really grow until the 9th century. And the first East Slavic communities are the result of the Norsemen coming down from Scandinavia, the Norsemen who played such a role in shaping Europe in the centuries after the departure of the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West. Norsemen came down the rivers from Scandinavia, settled in various small communities where there were Slavs, and formed the ruling elite. And they were called the Rus. And so the emergence of the first polities that associate the East Slavs together has something to do with the descent of these Norse rulers down the river Dnieper. And Kiev became the most important city in the early East Slavic Commonwealth. In 988, as I said, the Grand Prince of Kiev, who was the leading prince of these city-states in this area, and I'll show you a map in a minute, accepted Christianity and then went back to Kiev and ordered that all of his people throw away their idols and be baptized en masse in the river Dnieper, the river that runs through the center of Kiev. So this is a key moment in the history of the East Slavs, fundamentally important for our understanding of everything that comes later. This is where Orthodox Christianity arrives in the area. Kiev was the center of a series of East Slavic principalities from the 9th until the 13th centuries. But in 1240, the Mongols, the Tatar Golden Horde, swept across this part of Europe, sacking all of the East Slavic cities and making them tribute states. A remarkable empire. That's another story which would be a very separate lecture. Kiev was destroyed and did not recover for many centuries. In the 14th and 15th centuries, Kiev was held by the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. So in other words, by this period, Kiev is in the hands of non-Orthodox Catholic rulers and is part of a polity that is much more oriented towards Western Europe than Eastern Europe. Here is a view from one of the most important sites of East Slavic Christianity, the Monastery of the Caves on the hill in Kiev, out across the river Dnieper, towards the left bank of the river, which is mostly modern settlement, a picture that I took in 2019 when I was there. Monastery of the Caves, founded in 1051, is one of the most important sites, in fact, maybe the most important site of East Slavic Christianity, where East Slavs themselves, Rus themselves, began to be important as monastics, not just Byzantine imports. In 1569, when Lithuania and Poland were united, Kiev becomes the center of what is now a Polish administrative unit, a Polish province. Only in 1654 does Muscovy, the big East Slavic polity that grows to the east, finally, quote-unquote, regain Kiev, which remains, of course, Muscovite and then part of the Russian Empire and then part of the Soviet Union until 1991. For many ideologues in the East Slavic community, especially in Muscovy and then the Russian Empire, it has been very, very important to trace a continuous line back to medieval Kiev. This is one, believe it or not, of the great impulses behind the current president's policy. If you read the articles that he's published, articles that have been published in Russian, believe it or not, in Ukrainian, much to the ironic delight of the Ukrainian president, and in English, you will see this claim again and again in modern form. There is a direct line from modern Russia back to medieval Kiev, and that's why it is so metaphysically important to the current Russian government. Something that they don't remember, of course, very much in those articles, is that for many centuries, this part of the East Slavic world was actually in the orbit of Catholic powers. It's very Western in many ways in its culture, and in fact, in the 17th century in particular, Kiev was a very important conduit of Latin, partly secular and Catholic learning into Muscovy. The influence of Kiev on Muscovy is very profound, but it is not necessarily purely the influence of an Orthodox culture on another Orthodox culture. And indeed, if you walk around modern Kiev, you'll be very, very struck by how very un-Russian it looks in many ways. It is full, as it was rebuilt long after the sacking by the Mongols in 1240. It was rebuilt, of course, largely in Baroque style. Most of the churches are Baroque. It looks very, very different from Moscow or any of the other medieval cities around Moscow. Let's talk about the city at the other end, the western end of Ukraine now, what the Russians call Lvov, the Ukrainians call Lviv, which no one on the radio seems able to pronounce, I notice, and which was called, when it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Lemberg. So this was also a city founded in the medieval period, somewhat later than Kiev, and was for a time one of the most important East Slavic polities, largely because it wasn't as damaged by the Mongol invasions as cities to the east. It flourished as a Rus city-state for a time, but it then came under the control of Western powers. It was held by the Polish monarchy for many centuries. It was fought over by, among others, the Swedes, who sacked it in the 18th century. And in 1772, the first partition of Poland, this city became part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, when it was known as Lemberg. It was fought over by Russia, but actually claimed by Poland after the First World War and was part of interwar Poland. It was annexed by the USSR after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and then occupied by Germany during the war, becoming part of the Soviet Union in 1945. Lviv is a very, very Western country. It is relatively little touched by the Orthodox influence to the east, certainly not by Muscovite and even Russian imperial culture. It's a city of Baroque architecture, and it's a city very much marked by the Catholic West rather than the Orthodox East. So let's go back to the beginning now that I've told you the story of those two cities. This is where the first East Slavic polities grew up. And the first thing that you notice on this map, which I've shamelessly borrowed from Wikipedia, and which I've now lost, sorry. Jared, could you put that slide back, please? I'm sorry, my remote is not working very well. The map with the slide with the map of the Kievan polities. Sorry. What you notice on this map, which is the map of 10th century East Slavic Rus polities, is, of course, that there's no Moscow there. There was no Moscow at the time of the foundation of Kiev. There was no Moscow at the time of the Christianization of the Rus. Moscow is founded later, is a very small city, until it manages very successfully to play off the Tatar overlords. And now, of course, everything goes wrong with my PowerPoint. Sorry, I'm so sorry, Jared. There we go, thank you. So this is the cradle of East Slavic culture. This is the world of the Rus. Up here we have Novgorod and Ladoga. Down here we have Kiev, other cities, Vladimir later becoming important. These cities to the west, including Galich, Volhynia. Here is the river Dnieper, which is a key to the story of this part of the world. An area briefly held by the Rus. No Moscow on this map, and things significantly to the west of where Muscovy would grow up and expand in subsequent centuries. So in other words, if you're Ukrainian, you will see this as the origin of your culture and state. And if you're Belarusian, you might feel the same thing. But if you're a Russian ideologue, you will say, no, this is where Russia came from. This is one of the reasons why this area is so contested. The baptism of Rus, therefore, is a very important moment, and it becomes more and more important ideologically in the 19th century. If you go to Kiev today and see what I think is really a rather ugly cathedral, St. Vladimir's Cathedral, built in the late 19th century, one of the most important frescoes there, painted by a very famous Russian painter, Viktor Vaznetsov, is of the baptism of Rus taking place in the river Dnieper in 988. And this is a highly ideological painting, of course, claiming this is the beginning of all East Slavic culture. Sorry, the photograph isn't very good. It's kind of hard to take photographs of frescoes when you're leaning against a pillar and pointing your camera and just hoping that, that your flash doesn't go off so that someone comes on and tells you you've done something very naughty, but also hoping that your exposure is long enough to get something that actually works. I'm sure we've all been in that position. So what happened to Kiev and other Western cities in this world is, of course, that they, like many other East Slavic polities, came under the control of the Golden Horde, of the Mongol Empire, a remarkable empire which, of course, stretches from South Asia into modern Poland, but didn't recover. This is the extent of the Mongol Empire after the invasions of Rus. So Kiev is the cradle of East Slavic Christianity and indeed of East Slavic culture. The Russians like to call it the mother of Russian cities, but it's also a city of Western European Baroque. Here are the 17th and 18th century, some of the 17th, 18th, 19th century churches built on the site of the Monastery of the Caves, founded in 1051, this early moment of East Slavic monasticism. But here, for example, and you can already see they don't look at all like Russian churches. Here is a church and a very, very famous academy that had great influence in Muscovy itself. I visited this with a colleague who teaches there and who's now displaced in Germany in 2019. And rather foolishly, as we were walking into it, I said, oh my goodness, we could be in Poland. Wish I hadn't said that in front of a Ukrainian. But if you look at the church, you could be in Poland, and you certainly couldn't be in Moscow. So, for example, after the Mongol invasions, this part of the East Slavic world, Volhynia, becomes briefly important because it's not so touched by these invasions, but it is soon under the control of Western Catholic princes. And in the 20th century, this part of what is now Ukraine becomes the primary center of Ukrainian national aspirations. It doesn't enter the Russian Empire, as I said, until 1795. Meanwhile, the story of Muscovy. Moscow is founded in the 12th century, and for about 100, 150 years, it's a pretty small city, but gradually grows and expands its reach in the surrounding areas, but moves largely eastward for a long, long time. So this is the growth of the Muscovite Principality up until the middle of the 15th century. I'm sorry this is all in Cyrillic, but here is Moscow, and this is where Moscow's arms extend into really the early modern period. And Smolensk, even Smolensk in what is now Western Russia, is a long way outside the reach of Moscow, even in the mid-15th century. It's in the Duchy of Lithuania. So in other words, we're telling a story of constant contestation of these territories over many, many centuries. This is what Muscovy looked like at the beginning of the reign of Ivan IV, generally known in English as the Terrible, which, by the way, is a mistranslation of his subsequent Russian cognomen. This is Muscovy, and Kiev is still not, as it were, back, quote unquote, in the control of what are to become modern Russians, because Kiev is, I say it down here somewhere. This is Muscovy moving to the east, surrounded by other powers and contesting these territories with other powers. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, at its height, a Catholic power, occupied, or controlled, I should say, almost all of what is now modern Ukraine. These are territories that it lost in the late 17th century, but, for example, here is Chernigov, or Chernihiv in Ukrainian. Here is Kiev. Here is Polotsk. All of these areas, Polotsk in, that's not Polotsk, sorry, Polotsk is up here. All of these territories were for a time part of a Catholic empire. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, after the partitions of Poland in the 18th century, then acquires some of these territories. So here is modern Lviv, which they called Lemberg. Nearly all of Galicia is for a time controlled by Vienna. The expansion of Muscovy and of the Russian Empire continues, of course, and this is what happens up until the First World War. So eventually, Kiev, Odessa, Crimea all come under the control of the Russian Empire, mostly in the 17th century. Notice, however, that Lviv is still out of the Russian Empire. So how does all of this turn into what we have now? Well, of course, a lot has to do with ideas associated with the Romantic period and with the 19th century. It's important to bear in mind that nationalism and nation states are essentially a concept of the 19th century. They are not, they do not go back to the 9th century, whatever the current president may believe. They are essentially modern phenomena. I wish my remote were a bit more modern in its performance, I'm sorry. The European ideas of nation, which are the product, essentially, crudely speaking, of the Romantic age, are predicated on ideas of a shared culture and history, of common ethnic roots, and a shared language. These phenomena themselves, these ideas at least, are themselves largely modern creations. In Europe, ideas of nations and ideas of empire clash. Some of those empires are continental, Russia, Austro-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire. Some of them are overseas, Britain and France. But through the 19th century and into the 20th century, we have this clash of ideas between empires, which of course are large bodies governing very discrete and different groups of people, and nation states, which are supposedly units predicated upon one ethnic group. In this environment in Europe emerges modern nationalism. And that's exactly what happened in Ukraine. In the 19th century, the idea of a separate Ukrainian nation becomes more and more prevalent in the western lands of the Russian Empire. In the 20th century, there are Ukrainian nationalist movements, and very briefly, after the First World War, a Ukrainian state, which was soon dissolved and became part of the Soviet Union. Although, note, the Soviet Union itself built its imperial structures on a basis of units that, in a way, looked like nation states. The Russian Empire, of course, itself was multi-ethnic, although it was predominantly East Slavic. The vast majority of members of the Russian Empire were Russians, then Ukrainians, and then Belarusians, but there were at least 100 other peoples in the empire. It was huge, it was contiguous, and it itself, because of its ethnic composition and history, was itself caught between ideas of empire and ideas of a nation state. And these contradictions continue into the history of the Soviet Union. What about languages? I'm sure you're all thinking about this. What is the relationship of Ukrainian to Russian? Well, Ukrainian, Russian, and Belarusian are all descended from the language spoken in that area that we looked at for the 10th century. We call that language in Russian Древнерусский язык, and it's nearly always translated as Old Russian, although really it would be more accurate to call it the language of Old Rus, because from this language come all three of the current East Slavic languages: modern Russian, modern Ukrainian, and modern Belarusian. How close are these languages? There is a significant degree of mutual intelligibility. I'm married, as many of you know, to a Muscovite with a Ukrainian last name, by the way, also expressive of the paradoxes of this situation in the 20th and 21st centuries. My wife understands quite a lot of Ukrainian when she hears it on TV or on the radio, whereas I, not a native speaker, struggle a little bit more, although I can read Ukrainian somewhat. So there is a degree of mutual intelligibility to these three languages to this day. In the 19th century, Russian was, of course, the language of the empire. It was the language of high culture. All the East Slavs who wished to participate in high culture spoke and wrote Russian. Ukrainian was then at that time called Little Russian as a language, and Little Russia was a term applied to some of the Ukrainian, what we now call the Ukrainian lands. Ukrainian was in those days seen as a dialect rather than a language. Well, I'm sure you all know that the principal difference between a dialect and a language is that a language has an army and a dialect doesn't. These are, of course, there is a continuum, of course, and these are very, very conventional terms. But the ruling elite of the 19th century in the Russian Empire regarded Ukrainian as a sort of inferior dialect of Russian spoken by peasants, rich in folklore, but of course not a literary language, although it was by this stage becoming a literary language, but that's another story. And as you mentioned, even the word Ukraine in Russian is derived from the term meaning on the edge. The word krai means edge in Russian. So from the point of view of St. Petersburg or Moscow, Ukraine is the edge of the empire, even if it is also, of course, the point of beginning of this polity. So what's happening in eastern Ukraine now? Well, as I'm sure you all know, in 2014, increasing dissatisfaction with the Ukrainian government led to great disruption, especially in Kiev, the Euromaidan, and the then president was forced to flee. He fled to Russia and seems to be hoping to return in glory right now, which seems a bit unlikely now. The new leadership of the country proclaimed its orientation towards the West and the European Union. East of the river Dnieper, however, as I already said, the majority of the population probably is ethnic Russian, and Russian is the primary language spoken, much of that population identifying to this day as Russian. Some Russian speakers in Ukraine objected to what they saw as Ukrainianization of the East. Only Ukrainian is the official language of Ukraine. Shortly after the Sochi Olympics in 2014, a great success, promoting Russia as this can-do modern country, came a very opposite gesture. Russia sponsored the annexation of Crimea, Putin's little green men, and also supported violent separatist movements in two eastern provinces of Ukraine, the provinces of Luhansk and Donetsk. I find that combination very, very telling. One political scientist put it that Russia left the 20th century by the front door and by the back door simultaneously. By the front door into a globalized world, a globalized economy, a world of negotiation and relative peace and prosperity, and by the back door into gestures of 19th century empires. And in 2014, hosting the Olympic Games at huge cost, very successful Olympic Games, was going out the front door, and of course occupying Ukraine was going out the back door and behaving like a 19th century European empire. And these contradictions continue in Russia to this day. After 8 years of conflict in those territories, in February of 2022, as I'm sure you all know, the Russian government recognized these two breakaway territories that it had supported and from which over 1 million people had fled as independent countries. When that happened, I think we all knew what was going to happen, what was going to happen next. I must say, for a long time, I, like many, many people, thought that this was Russian saber-rattling, this was all for domestic consumption, although, as my oldest son put it, as soon as we saw the Russians were building field hospitals on the Ukrainian border, we knew something was afoot, and after the recognition of those territories as independent states, of course, we knew what was coming. This is somewhat similar to Russia's policy in other border regions, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, which are under de facto Russian control, although they are de jure part of Georgia, a neighboring country, and Transnistria in Moldova on the eastern side of the Dniester River, where, again, Russian support has encouraged this breakaway territory. Russia has liked these frozen conflicts, some not so frozen, of course, and one not at all frozen right now, as a way of destabilizing and weakening neighbors who may look to the west. A few days after that recognition, as you all know, on the 24th of February, Russia invaded. And for me, and probably for many of you, that's one of those dates in your life that you'll never forget. I remember as a very small child, for example, being told that the American president had been assassinated. I remember the invasion of the Falkland Islands as an Englishman. I remember the moment I heard about that. I remember, of course, 9/11, and I'll never forget waking up and seeing the BBC headline when I switched on my phone, Russia invades Ukraine. I thought, you must be kidding, a few airstrikes. No, Russia had indeed invaded Ukraine on the 24th of February. So what does the Russian leadership say about all of this? And forgive me that a lot of this talk is about Russia. I'm a Russianist, I understand this more, and I think to understand the conflict, we really have to see what Russia is doing. What does the Russian leadership say, crudely speaking? The president claims that Ukraine is an artificial creation, the product of those Leninist nationality policies which led to the creation of all those ethnic units in the Soviet Union. And for that reason, it's an illegitimate state. That's a rather curious position, because that would render, if you follow that line, illegitimate probably 2/3 of the countries in the world right now. All of the countries in post-colonial Africa, all of the countries in the post-colonial Americas, and a significant number of countries in Western Europe. Belgium, anyone? Or even Italy or modern Germany. However, Putin is arguing from this metaphysical position that goes right back to the 9th century. By the way, in the recent years, a huge and very ugly statue of Prince Vladimir I, the Christianizer of the East Slavic peoples, has been erected next to the Kremlin. The Ukrainians put up their statue in the 19th century, but the Russians decided to put one up next to the Kremlin in the 21st century. Ukrainians made all these jokes about Vladimir waking up and saying, "Where the blazes am I?" Because where the blazes is he? There was no Moscow in the 9th century when he baptized his people, of course. But the Russian government, especially its leader, argues Ukrainians, and by implication Belarusians too, are part of a single national group with the Russians, sharing a culture that goes right back to medieval Kiev. Russian speakers in Ukraine, they claim, are subject to discrimination, unfair discrimination, repression, and even genocide. The Russians have repeatedly used this term. We are trying to stop genocide in Ukraine, the genocide of ethnic Russians, Russian speakers. The West, of course, first and foremost the United States, is using this artificially created state to threaten Europe. To threaten Russia, excuse me. I wish I could threaten my remote. Sorry. The Ukrainian leadership, with its Jewish president, note, needs to be denazified, and Ukraine must be demilitarized and made neutral. Why do the Russians keep saying that Ukraine is full of Nazis? Well, there are a number of reasons, but one of the principal ones is that nationalist movements in Ukraine in the Second World War found themselves in an unfortunate, to say the least, alliance with the Germans, thinking that Nazi Germany would free Ukraine from Soviet influence. That didn't work out very well for them, didn't work out very well for any of the ethnic groups and national groups in Eastern Europe that thought the Nazis would help them. But of course that legacy remains, and some of the leaders of those movements are now considered in certain parts of Ukraine national heroes. As you can imagine, the Russians don't like that very much. And this is probably the source of this perception that the Ukrainian leadership with its Jewish president is National Socialist. A grotesque idea, of course. NATO expansion, say the Russians, is a constant threat to Russia and must be stopped. Talking of leadership, we should probably talk about the Orthodox Church for a moment. The Russian Orthodox Church has, at least at the top of its leadership, supported the so-called special military operations. I'm sure you all know you're not allowed to call it a war in Russia. The Patriarch talks of defending Holy Rus, this creation of this integral and Orthodox community of the East Slavs. Even the term Holy Rus is, by the way, an ahistorical term. It is not a term that dates from the medieval period. It is largely a construction of much later times. But it's an idea and an ideology that motivates a great deal of thought in this day. How does that have impact on Ukraine? The majority of Orthodox parishes in Ukraine are still under the leadership of the Moscow Patriarchate. But that won't be for very long, I think, now. Many of those parishes have stopped including the Moscow Patriarch in their prayers and will almost certainly, I think, move to an autocephalous, independent Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Don't forget, the Orthodox Church is not like the Catholic Church. It is not singularly pyramid in structure. Individual patriarchs have a great deal more independence than is the case with the leadership of the Catholic Church below the Pope. So this is almost certainly going to happen. It's a disaster for the Russian Church, just as the invasion is a disaster for the Russian state, in my opinion. So the Russian president for a long time seemed a pragmatist. What has happened? Well, of course, for a long time he has been making these very, very militaristic noises, these very anti-American noises. But I think a lot of us thought that most of that, at least, was for domestic consumption. Let's talk up, our own separate path. Let's talk about how we're in favor of family values. We're not like the West. We don't like any of this LGBTQ stuff. We don't like all of this cancel culture. We have a different route to take. And of course, we're going to be very opposed to the West culturally in that area. But we'll still go on, we all assumed, being tied into the world economy. I have to confess to you that 3.5 years ago, I gave another lecture in this group in which I argued we couldn't possibly have another Cold War because Russia was so deeply embedded in the global economy and in global culture. Well, I was right in a way. We don't have another Cold War. We have a hot war, the hottest war in Europe since 1945. How has this come about? It's clear, firstly, that around the president now, when he began his years in office, he kept a balance of advisors. Those who'd been with him when he was in the administration of the city of Leningrad, who were seen as liberals, and those who'd been around him when he was in the security services, who were seen as hawks. He's now surrounded exclusively by hawks, and he is now surrounded by hawks who are essentially yes men as well. That inner circle is very beholden to the president now, and the president himself in the COVID years has clearly become very isolated and obviously become very obsessed with the issues that have led to this horrendous conflict. The narrative, of course, that has been sold for the last 20 years about Russia is that Russia was humiliated in the 90s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Russia was taken advantage of. Russia became very poor. Russia was a pariah in the world. Russia has to make up for that humiliation, and its growing strength in the 20th century, fueled by sound fiscal policies, and of course by the price of petroleum products, especially oil, has led to a resurgence that has actually benefited most Russian citizens, even if it's benefited the very rich a great deal more than anyone else. The extension of that narrative leads to what we've seen now. The invasion of Ukraine, and again, you're not supposed to use the word invasion, of course, in Russia. The invasion of Ukraine is the extreme version of this compensating for Russia's humiliation in the 1990s. I have to add that in the United States, there is a school of very learned men led by, and probably women, although I only know of men in the group, led by John Mersheimer at the University of Chicago, who promote what's called the realist school of approach to international studies. This argument is that the West should never have provoked Russia, that there are always spheres of influence for every major country, that it was a mistake to expand NATO, this was a provocation to Russia, and never mind how bad the Russians have been in the last couple of months, all of this is the result of Western missteps. An argument that actually allies itself, although it probably doesn't intend to, with this Russian narrative that has led to the invasion. Personally, I don't subscribe to that, but what do I know? I'm not a political scientist, just a mere philologist. Russian foreign policy in the last 20, even 30 years has often been, of course, ad hoc and opportunist. It's often been hard to see that there is a real set of strategies. The tactics are obvious, but it's been hard to see is there a real strategy here? And I think you need to bear that in mind too, because it seemed, I think, to the Russians that here was another big opportunity. Why was there such a big opportunity? The United States was weak. It had weak leadership. And this, in the current administration, it had this absolutely disastrous and chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. The EU is always weak and divided, and of course Brexit made it seem much more divided. What other circumstances might we think about? NATO could never agree on anything, and the countries in NATO don't even want to support it half the time, and the American administration, the last American administration, was very reluctant to support NATO. And meanwhile, Ukrainian governments are always unstable, which indeed they have been, and the Ukrainian economy is very bad. This was a great mix of opportunities. So I think there is a degree of opportunism as well as this long-lasting set of narratives. Of course, in all of those things, the Russians turned out to be quite incorrect. I think, too, the Russian leadership, isolated as it is, believed its own propaganda. They really believed that there was no Ukrainian nation. They believed that the country was run by Nazis, and they believed that in the Russian-speaking East, the Russians were subject to genocide. They thought that Russian troops really would be greeted as liberators. I have to tell you, I was in Ukraine in late 2019 and plan to go back the next year. We all know what happened in 2020. I spent most of my time with Russian speakers. Never did I hear people speak of a genocide of Russian speakers in the eastern provinces. Never did I hear anyone, from taxi drivers to my colleagues in major Ukrainian universities, say, we wish we were part of Russia. And this is from Russian speakers. Meanwhile, I think many of us thought that Russia was much too embedded in the global economy and global culture, in all of these other activities, its exercise of soft power through sport, etc., to do something that seemed to come from history 100 years before. Well, we were so wrong. Russia was willing to contemplate the risk, and it turns out that the CIA and MI6, the American and British intelligence services, were right, and those of us who had a softer view were wrong. Russia really has chosen the back door, in the words of that political scientist. So what happens now? The war, of course, has been a human catastrophe, an absolutely horrendous human catastrophe for Ukraine. It has also been an unmitigated military disaster for Russia, without any doubt whatsoever. But if you think it's going to end soon because of that reason, well, it might, but I think there are two words you should bear in mind before you get too optimistic, and those two words are Chechnya and Aleppo. Look what happened in the territory of the Russian Federation, in Chechnya, in the 1990s. Look what happened in Aleppo, where also the Russians, of course, saw an opportunity provided by the last but one American administration, which is another story. Russia has been willing, even in its own territory in Chechnya, to take horrendous actions in order to subdue an enemy, never mind in the Middle East, and Russia has sponsored a series of frozen conflicts elsewhere in order to weaken and destabilize its neighbors and assert its own hegemonic claims. As one of my colleagues said in a recent public forum that some of you may have watched, you have to think of this without thinking purely in terms of realpolitik or anything like that. The goal of the regime is almost metaphysical. I should emphasize that right now the goal of the regime is not to restore the Soviet Union, although that might float across the mind later. The goal is to recreate a unity of the East Slavic peoples, really to recreate this Holy Rus that never was. And if you're dealing with an administration that has a metaphysical goal, then you have certain problems in negotiation, I would suggest to you. The fact that this is a crazy metaphysical goal, and it discounts the fact that many of the parts of what is now the Russian Federation have nothing to do with medieval East Slavic polities, is beside the point, of course. Kaliningrad, anyone? That exclave which was once part of East Prussia and is now part of Russia, surrounded by EU countries. Many thinking Russians, most of the people I talk to in Russia, correspond with or what have you, are absolutely appalled by this. A good number of intellectuals have left. I was particularly struck by a couple of statements, including one by the political scientist and journalist Sergei Medvedev, who wrote, as he left his country, he couldn't stand living in Moscow anymore with the taste of blood in his mouth, and that he couldn't stand watching Russia commit suicide. Many Russian intellectuals think like this. Anton Dolin, the film critic, who also left the country, wrote about how Ukraine would recover, but who knows what would happen to Russia. It would take generations to get over this. That's true about intellectuals and true about a lot of my friends who write rather desperate letters, including a friend of mine who came to a church service here just 4 years ago, when she was artist in residence at the University of Michigan. But the truth is that the majority of the population who get their news largely from what is now tightly controlled official media probably support this military action and do believe that it is liberating and that it is stopping a genocide of Russians. As Russian fatalities mount, and they've clearly been far greater than the 1,000 or so announced by the Ministry of Defense recently. The Americans have suggested 14,000, the Ukrainians have suggested 17,000. As fatalities mount, it is possible there will be public dissatisfaction, but I remind you of something else. This is the successor to a country that sacrificed nearly 30 million lives to win the bloodiest and most horrendous conflict that humanity, in its foolishness, has managed. It cost 27 to 30 million lives for the Soviet Union to win the Second World War. The Second World War has become, once again, a touchstone of patriotism in Putin's Russia, and it reminds us that the Russians are willing to tolerate things that maybe other countries would not. Russian military leadership, of course, has been absolutely dreadful. All of the errors of its clumsy chain of command have been displayed. Its tactics and its strategy have both been inadequate. But that might well change. Don't forget that a new chief commander has been appointed this week. Who knows how it will happen, how it will turn out. What can we do? I'm afraid this is my last slide and a very pessimistic one. Of course, one of the things that has happened is that the very opposite of Russia's goals have been achieved so far. If Ukraine was somewhat disunited before, it is now completely united. Something that I wish the English-speaking media would do more is identify what language the people they interview for pieces on TV and on radio are speaking. Because if you listen carefully, you will find that, for the most part, Ukrainian speakers and Russian speakers, interviewed by Western media and interviewed by independent Russian media, that is to say, media now, alas, outside of the Russian Federation, are saying the same thing. We do not hear Russian speakers expressing the slightest sympathy, for the most part, for the Russian state, although there is a very small minority of people in Ukraine who support this action. And why would you when your cities are being razed to the ground? NATO and the EU are both remarkably united, more united than they've ever been before. The Ukrainian government suddenly has strong backing across the country. In other words, the very opposite of Russia's goals so far has been the result of this action. But that won't stop the war, and still less will it guarantee a Ukrainian victory, despite the many small-scale victories that have been achieved so far. NATO will not risk direct conflict with Russia, and Russia doesn't look like backing down despite all of its military failures. Incidentally, one of the profound ironies of this action is that a disproportionate number of Russian fatalities are from non-Russians. The Buryat people, traditionally Buddhist people in Siberia, have contributed a disproportionate number of Russian Federation fatalities. Large numbers of people from the Caucasus have died in the Russian army in Ukraine. In other words, people of quite different national and religious traditions are fighting in order to restore this notional orthodox polity. The impact of that, I don't know. I was reading an article this morning about Dagestan, which is in the South Caucasus, and which is an Islamic region, in which many of the people mourning their dead sons still spoke of the rightness of this action. But there is a profound irony in the disproportion of non-ethnic Russian, non-Orthodox soldiers who are losing their lives in Putin's action. Finding what the Americans call an off-ramp for Russia, which is probably the most important thing that could be done now, will be very, very hard, because the Russians have set these very big goals, and the Kremlin, believe it or not, does watch public opinion privately, very, very carefully. Don't believe the official polls that are published, but do believe that they are monitoring the popularity of the president and the regime very, very carefully. Ultimately, the Russian leadership is in fact very fragile. Institutions of power in Russia are very weak. Everything is based around individuals and their support group. If things begin to go wrong, then things will be very, very bad, and the current structures will prove very, very fragile. In the Kremlin, they know that and do watch public opinion. But right now, public opinion remains very much in support of the country. The status quo ante, which is probably the best that Ukraine could wish for, will not be acceptable to Russia and isn't very acceptable to Ukraine either. So I'm not a diplomat, but I see a great deal of difficulty in coming to any kind of resolution beyond another frozen conflict and intermittent ceasefire. But let's hope I'm wrong. So, ladies and gentlemen, forgive me in this brief survey, but my last remark is one that is both perhaps appropriate in this house of worship and really very pessimistic. Maybe that's why it won't come up. All we can do, I think, ultimately, is send whatever aid we can risk to Ukraine, hope, and indeed, since we're in church, pray. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I hope that was enlightening. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Going back to the beginning, Rus, R-U-S, was it? And you said it comes from the Norse?
Yeah, the first organized polities in the East Slavic lands are the result of the arrival of Scandinavians who form city-states with Slavs as their population. The ruling elite is Scandinavian, just like this is the story, of course, of so many parts of Europe. Why do we call Normandy Normandy? Because it's Norsemen and so on and so forth. Large parts of Great Britain were polities formed by the Norsemen, and they call themselves the Rus. So the source of this word for the East Slavs is actually a Scandinavian word. Oh, and by the way, names like Olga, Oleg, and so on and so forth, these are Scandinavian names in origin. Helga.
The very important river in Ukraine starts with the letter N. Can you spell it for me?
It starts with the letter D, actually. I spell it in transliteration from the Russian D-N-E-P-R. It's generally spelt in English D-N-I-E-P-R. And the Ukrainians, I think, call it Dnipro, D-N-I-P-R-O. So start with a D and an N, and you'll find it. If you like, we can go back to that slide, but I think that would be an imposition on Jared. You can see that this is the river that divides Ukraine. To the east of that, more people are ethnic Russians and Russian-speaking. To the west, more people are Ukrainian and Ukrainian-speaking. And this is the river down which came those Norsemen over 1,000 years ago to found these city-states. Barbara.
I'm curious about the news that people are getting. Is this on? Yeah. So the separatist regions, are they able to get news that's not filtered through Russian? And then the second question, I don't understand the concept of separatist, that Putin grants them separate, or what are independent, says they're independent states, and yet he's claiming them. So how are they independent? What are they independent from, Ukraine?
No, independent from Ukraine. Okay, first of all, over the last 15 years, 20 years perhaps, across the entire territory of Russia, the media, which was so diverse and independent in the 1990s, have increasingly come under the control of the state, especially TV, which maybe isn't watched by people of the age of our children and, dare I say, grandchildren, but is, of course, watched by most Russians of, dare I say, our age. So the Russian media, the big media, have been state-controlled for a long time. Certain independent media remained until this year, and they were accessible everywhere, including in these separatist territories. In the separatist territories, however, over 1 million people have left, fleeing what was the conflict and probably disapproving of these enclaves. Secondly, of course, their information is very strictly controlled, first of all by the local administration and then by Russia. Russia has sponsored these two breakaway movements, breakaway from Ukraine, but never recognized them as independent states until this year. And Russia recognized them as independent states, which as far as I know almost no one else in the world has done, immediately before the invasion. And part of the narrative of the invasion was to support these independent states and, by implication, to extend their territory. Does that answer the questions, Barbara? In this part of the world, everything is complicated. Paul, I'm coming over with the microphone. Okay, but don't forget this is for broadcasting, so it probably helps.
You mentioned that the leadership in Russia is sensitive to public opinion, but I think also you said we should take a dose of skepticism about what we hear.
Right.
I heard something like 80% approval. What kind of a grain or lump of salt should we take that with?
That's a very difficult question to answer. The polls that are published show huge support for the action, but they're not conducted scientifically. They ask very particular questions that elicit those remarks. Meanwhile, in the Kremlin, it's very clear from leaks that a great deal of monitoring of public opinion is going on. Having said all of that, I would doubt very much that there is a majority at the moment against the war. The majority of Russians support the war. They are perhaps ill-informed. The discourse of official patriotism has been huge in the last 20 years. Anti-Americanism, this narrative of humiliated Russia having to recover, this strikes a chord with people, and the current president remains relatively popular also for, economic reasons. What else should we look at? Russia was very impoverished at the beginning of the Putin years. Putin regime has been fiscally very responsible and maybe economically rather lucky. It's true that a lot of people got small number of people got very, very rich, but most people are much better off than they were 20-odd years ago. So that is another thing that backs up the support for the president. So there was another question over here.
Give it to you next. We hear Ukraine referred to as the breadbasket. So I would imagine it's going to have implications for world hunger.
It's already having implication for world hunger. This is one of the largest wheat-producing areas in the world. It's very rich agricultural land. If you look, and now I'm back on territory where I am more comfortable, at 19th century Russian literature, Ukraine is always represented, these western parts of the Russian Empire are always represented as rich and prosperous, where everything grows so well. The climate is warmer. This is a land where you can grow, all kinds of melons, all kinds of fruit, and endless amounts of grain. The consequences are already evident. The price of wheat is going up in the world. The price of bread will go up. This will add to food insecurity across the world without the slightest doubt.
So you've talked about the interest in the Orthodox Church in Russia to recreate some kind of
integral East Slavic community. Right.
Yeah, exactly, integrated Slavic community. What are the predominant religions in Ukraine right now, given its history? Is Catholicism, for example?
Okay, the majority religion is Orthodoxy. There are significant numbers of Catholics, and there are also significant numbers of what are called Greek Catholics. That is to say, people who recognize the authority of Rome, but observe the Orthodox rite. This is for historical reasons to do with the Union of Brest. And I see my friend Tim nodding his head here. So, exactly, a large number of people, especially in the western parts of Ukraine, follow the Orthodox rite, but acknowledge the authority of Rome. But the majority overall of the country is Orthodox. And what was once a large Jewish population is, of course, post-Second World War, post-Holocaust, much diminished. Oh, yes.
Since you're in the literature, and I happen to love to read, can you recommend a good book that would be good for us to read, to learn, but it's kind of entertaining?
Oh, goodness. I think I'm going to pass the buck on that one to my colleague, the Slavic librarian of the Hatcher Library at the University of Michigan, who has put together a very, very useful site. I shared some of this information with my fellow deacons a few weeks ago, but if you just go to the website of the Hatcher Library, or just maybe just Google UMish Ukraine, you will find a very extensive list of recommendations, including things that I think are fairly readable. And I have to confess to you, I'm not a Ukrainianist. I mean, I may be married to a woman with a Ukrainian name. I may have been in Kiev a couple of years ago, but I'm a Russianist, so I would hesitate to recommend enthusiastically something largely on Ukraine. Hatcher Library, yes, I'm passing the buck, but I think I'm passing it rather effectively.
So this may be totally, I'm just curious about your thoughts even though it's what we're all wondering and can't figure out. So Ukraine is a very cultured, beautiful country, lots of resources. It's understandable why Russia would want it as part of its, but why then go in and pulverize anything that's useful in the country? What good, is that simply vengeance? I mean, what's to be gained?
Yes, that's a logical question for a situation that doesn't seem terribly logical. I think the initial expectation was rapid victory. I think the Russians thought, even with completely the wrong military strategy, that they would take Kiev very quickly. They did not go in intending to pound cities like Mariupol. And don't forget, the only city of any size that Russia has held is Kherson. And even its control of Kherson is in doubt. It does not yet control Mariupol. It has not taken Chernihiv. It is, of course, Kharkiv is under threat, but it's still not been taken. Even Mariupol, bombed to smithereens, is still not totally under Russian control. Why have they done that? They have defaulted to what they did in Aleppo and what they did in Chechnya when they couldn't hold these territories any other way. Chechnya, territory within the Russian Federation. It is a default choice. It is a clumsy choice. It is a counterproductive choice. And they won't be able to do in any part of Ukraine that they continue to hold what they have been able to do in Chechnya, which is spend a huge amount of money and install a former enemy as now a pro-Putin leader. That's Ramzan Kadyrov, who of course is now fighting in Ukraine with his Chechen troops. But they've defaulted, to, as I understand it, to what they've done in the past because the initial goals were not achieved as they thought they would be. And damn the consequences, of course, to put it bluntly. Jane.
Is it on? Oh,
yeah,
it is on.
Certainly is.
So I'm always interested in the effect an individual can have in these conflicts, in other wars and stuff. And so my question is about, following up a little bit, the fact that the conflict has not turned out the way the Russians thought it would. And my understanding is that's largely due to resistance from the Ukrainians because...
and Russian incompetence.
And, you know, because the United States is kind of dragging its feet, so there's not... Anyway, my question is about Zelensky and what you think his role has been, considering that probably no one thought he would be such an amazing leader.
Right. Yes, I mean, Zelensky was pretty unpopular by this year because, of course, economic problems, political problems continue for Ukraine. There was a joke going around in Ukraine. If you remember, the last Ukrainian president, Pyotr Poroshenko, was a candy magnate, one of the wealthiest men in the country. Zelensky, of course, is a former comic actor who played an accidental president in a popular TV series in Ukraine, as I'm sure you all know. The joke in Ukraine at the beginning of the year was, it wasn't sweet under Poroshenko, and it's not funny under Zelensky. But what do you know? Zelensky and the Ukrainians, led by a very efficient actor, have won the information war hands down. This is Zelensky's greatest achievement. I mean, he's conducted himself, it seems, as a wartime leader very, very well, but he has used media, he's used his addresses everywhere extremely efficiently. He comes to the United States and quotes, you know, things that every American knows. He goes to the British Parliament, he quotes Churchill. You know, he goes to Israel and isn't quite so successful because a lot of Israeli Jews don't particularly think highly of the conduct of many Ukrainians in the Second World War, but still he makes all these claims, and he has won the information war very, very efficiently. The Ukrainians have been very, very good at that. So that's been, for external purposes, his main achievement as a leader. And other than that, of course, he stood firm. The Russians thought he would flee Kiev, and he didn't. He stayed there, walked about the city, used social media, broadcast images of himself. He's used the media in a way that his opposite number has completely failed to do, and for obvious reasons. Sorry. Oh, I think I didn't switch it on. press it until the green light comes on.
Could you talk a little bit about the implications of the Ukrainians shutting off the water to Crimea, and if that might in the future be a negotiating point?
Well, the Russians have spent billions of dollars, I think, building that bridge from Russia to Ukraine. I don't see much that the Ukrainians can do to have real impact on Russian control of Crimea, including switching off water myself. The Russians have been willing to invest huge amounts of money in supporting Crimea and will continue to do so, water or no water, in my opinion. Switching off, of course, gas going through Ukraine, that would have a big impact for the Russian economy, but it will also have huge impact for the German economy and the Italian economy, so probably that isn't going to happen either. Reverend Livingston, who had a much better statement on this issue than I did in his
I think there's one more question from Lou Solbeck, and then I was going to say, again, our thanks, but let's ask Lou first.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, just interested in your take on, because you didn't mention anything about Paul Manafort's influence on putting, the puppet that preceded Zelensky and all the stuff going on with that administration and Putin.
There have been plenty of political and other problems with the Ukrainian administration, but it seems to me that Manafort was more of a problem for the American administration than the Ukrainian administration. He certainly had very expensive taste in clothes, as I remember. I think that's really a trivial issue in Ukraine, albeit a big issue in America. But of course, Ukraine, even more than Russia, is full of corrupt enterprises, opportunities for making money at the expense of the population, and so on and so forth. And that has been exploited by Westerners just as it has been by Ukrainians, and just as the same is true in Russia. But I don't think that's I don't think the Ukrainian connections with the previous administration in the United States are all that important here, personally.
Michael, I don't know how we can thank you for this amazing presentation.
Thank you.
For what we learned. I had one couple on their way out saying, man, I wish we could have had this 5-10 years ago and had that information already at hand. You did an exceptional job. Last minute, by the way, people, it was in the last week and a half or 2 weeks that Michael stepped forward to provide us with this presentation today. It was a lot of hard work. You are a fascinating speaker, a well-researched person when it comes to talking to us about these issues, and we want to give you our ovation and thank you for being part of it. So thank you all for staying today, by the way. We so appreciate